You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Hi, I'm Annie in Boston.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you're listening to your favorite international podcast. Happy 200th, everyone! We've been doing this for 200 episodes.
200.
Wow! Time flew by. We've been through the pandemic together. We've experienced family loss. We laughed. We cried. And we still haven't met in real life. But that doesn't mean we didn't really become great friends in those 200 episodes. I hope, Annie.
I hope more. Should we explain to them what that means? No. For now, it's sufficient to say that's how we, and by that I mean very specifically you and I, say I love you. One thing before we start, please don't forget to vote for us. Sorry, everyone, but listen, we've been doing this for 200 episodes. So please don't forget to vote for us in the People's Choice Podcast Awards. You have until July 31st for the first round. The first round just gets us through the nominations to the final voting. So go to podcastawards.com, register, verify your email to prove that you're not a bot, and please check the little box that asks you if you would like to be considered for final voting, because a random selection of those people who check that box will be chosen to vote for the winner. You can vote for us in the following categories: female hosted and history, which we are defending. Also, true crime and people's choice, which are huge categories that we probably have no chance in. But listen, we're just going to try. It's all we can do. So please go vote for us.
We do it in the Olympic spirit. Dabei sein ist alles.
That's right. Johanna wants one more trophy. Just one more.
Just one more.
Just one more. And then we'll move to a different awards for different shaped trophies. I don't know.
And maybe a different season.
That's true. And if you want to know more about all of that and everything else, listen to next week, because we have a lot to talk about right now.
Or last week's.
Or last week. Yeah. Listen to the end of any other episode. We're not going to do it today, because today we have a lot to talk about. It's time to get right into the topic of our 200th episode. It's so exciting.
Exciting, but also a little bit scary and kind of intimidating. I'll tell you in a second why I feel like that.
Agreed. Yeah, I feel the same way. So yeah, for our special 200th episode, we are very, very excited to present to you a special 3-part series on the Amityville horror. Yay!
Now, before those of you who aren't into ghost stories turn off, wait a second. Yeah. We know some of you are not. We read the reviews. It's fine. This is how it's going to work. So, today in part 1, we're going to cover the very tragic, incredibly sad story of the DeFeo family murders. This is a very true and very tragic part of the story, and it's often overshadowed by later events and also the sensation of the haunting to follow. But this case is awful and sad and haunting in its very own way, and the story of that family deserves to be told.
Absolutely. It's really the most important part of the story. Then next week, we are going to talk about the haunting of the DeFeo house, known as the Amityville horror. All about the Lutz family who moved into the home after the murders. And so next week, our primary source will be the nonfiction book written by Jay Anson about their ordeal, quote-unquote nonfiction. If you listened to our intro, God, how long ago was that, Johanna? Was that 4 years ago?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, I hope you didn't listen to it, actually. But I think I talk about what a core spooky memory that book in particular was for me, and how it's really shaped me as someone into the paranormal and into true crime. It also created a mile fly phobia that's lasted for over 35 years. Not that I'm bitter. So yeah, next week we're going to tell you the scary story. We're hoping to scare the pants off of you. And that does mean different things to listeners in different countries, and we're fine with that.
But people who hate the paranormal, fear not.
Yeah.
In part 3, we are going to talk about how the murder of the DeFeo family and the Amityville horror are linked. And it has nothing to do with ghosts. We're going to talk about some of the more interesting theories and the conspiracy theories out there, the myth, the rumors. We'll definitely be debunking a lot of commonly held beliefs, and as always, we'll do our best to explain what actually happened in both the murders and the haunting.
That's right. And a lot of it you'll have to decide for yourself. But is this another case where I went into it completely believing this was a legitimate haunting, and now I've ruined it with research? You're going to have to wait for part 3 to find out.
Now, the reason why I said this whole thing is interesting but also rather intimidating, what I didn't know back in the day before we started this podcast was that there are people out there who are experts and kind of layman experts on certain high-profile cases, like, for example, Jack the Ripper, or Ted Bundy, or the Zodiac. And in my naive mind, I thought, oh, Annie and I will do this podcast for fun and we'll talk about these cases and it's easy. Yeah, well, it turned out that, of course, that's not how that works, because we always want to do a good job and we want to do these stories justice, and it's a lot of work. And let's face it, when you do a 1 or 2 hour episode about one of these high profile cases, there's always just so much you can cover and you'll always miss certain aspects. And that's normal and to be expected. If you talk about some obscure Austrian case from 1863, then it's a bit easier, right? But if you talk about something where there is a lot of info out there and a lot of people with very strong opinions and a lot of knowledge, then it can become very scary. I hope you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you mean. I think they do too. But in this case, between mafia ties, the Warrens, who have a very cult-like following, there's a lot of stuff to talk about that people have very strong opinions on. Every single aspect of this case, from the murders to the haunting, has honestly countless theories. There are so many theories between the murders and the haunting. And we are going to do our very best to include everything that we can that we found to be important, but that's obviously going to be subjective in a case like this. So I think both of us are really looking forward to chatting with all of you about your thoughts and feelings on this case. We're going to be having our next Patreon night. It's the 27th of July, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And we'll be discussing this case then, so with our murder tier. So I'm positive that our listeners are going to have... I'm really looking forward, actually, to everything that our listeners will have to contribute to in terms of thoughts and facts and knowledge that we just don't. We have the smartest listeners.
That being said, as always, we will do our best and we will give you as much information and facts as possible. Also, today we have something in this episode that we have never done before. We have an interview with someone who actually was able to talk to the culprit after he had been sentenced. That's exciting.
It is.
Alright, as always, we'll give you some super quick background info on the place where this all happened. It will be of some interest, especially in next week's episode. So let's talk a bit about the history of the village of Amityville. The village of Amityville is located in Suffolk County on Long Island, New York, on the southern shore of Long Island to be exact, approximately 20 miles or 32 kilometers east of New York City. If you would start at the south end of Central Park, it would take you somewhere between 1 hour 15 minutes and 2 hours to drive to Amityville, depending on traffic. Today, Amityville, with its population of 9,500, is primarily a residential community with a mix of housing types including single-family homes, townhouses, and apartment buildings. It has a suburban atmosphere characterized by tree-lined streets and well-maintained neighborhoods. It's also situated right at the Great South Bay, which is a body of water that separates Long Island from Jones Beach State Park. The bay provides scenic views and recreational opportunities for residents and visitors. Of course, long before Amityville was filled with these pretty residential homes, Long Island was the home of several Native American tribes, most notably in the area of Amityville. Forgive me if I mispronounce it. So, the Shinnecock tribe, they occupied the eastern portion of Southampton, near Shinnecock Bay and Shinnecock Hills. The Unkachuck tribe lived on the eastern end of Long Island. The Montaukett tribe resided in the area around Montauk Point, that's located at the eastern tip of Long Island, and the Saugatuck tribe resided in the central part of Suffolk County near present-day West Islip and Babylon. Around 1650, the first European settlers arrived in the area of New York. These were Dutch settlers. Famously, Peter Stuyvesant was the governor of the Dutch colony New Netherlands that spanned from Delaware to Cape Cod. There's a lot of history about how the native tribes were tricked and underpaid and how they subsequently suffered even more injustice. And there's a lot of myth surrounding these facts, and they will become more important in episode 2 and maybe even a little bit in episode 3.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
By the way, in the beginning, the area was known as Huntington West Neck South. But of course, that doesn't roll off the tongue smoothly.
Where are you from? Huntington West Neck South.
And so the name was changed to Amityville in 1846. Now, there are several stories where that name came from. One says that during a town meeting, a heated discussion was taking place when one of the participants proclaimed, "What this meeting needs is some amity." In another version, it is said that a prominent member of the community, the mill owner Samuel Ireland, owned a boat that was called Amity, and the village was named after said boat.
Yeah.
You know what? That's so funny for me. When I first heard about the Amityville horror story, I always found it so uncomfortable in a way that such a nice word like amity stands for all the horrible things that happened there.
Yeah. As far as my childhood is concerned, Amity is like the waters are full of vengeful sharks, but on land, that's where the demons are. So you fucked.
Mm-hmm. A couple of more things about Amityville. In 1894, it got incorporated into the bigger town of Babylon. Also, and that's something I found extremely interesting, in the early 20th century, Amityville became a very famous and beloved tourist destination. There were a lot of fancy beachfront hotels celebrities loved to visit. Annie Oakley, one of the stars of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and the subject of Annie Get Your Gun, was a frequent guest. And another rather infamous person even owned a house in Amityville, Al Capone. It is said that he, quote, sold his soul to the devil, end quote, in Amityville, where he built a bootlegging operation during the Prohibition, so way before he went to Chicago. Basically, Amityville is where he went from a young nobody to one of the most famous gangsters in the history of mankind. Annie, did you know that one of Al Capone's nicknames, and he had many, but one of them was Snorky?
Snorky? If he could
Scary,
swim
right?
Underwater, where would he go? There was a, that probably means nothing to you. There was a TV show in the 80s, a cartoon on Saturday morning.
Too.
Did you the Snorks?
Yeah.
Would you rather be a Snork or a Smurf?
Smurf.
Oh, see, I'm Team Snork all the way.
So he was named Snorky.
I love that.
But not because he could swim underwater. Back in the day, Snorky was a kind of colloquial term for somebody who was a sharp dresser.
Oh.
And that's why his friends called him that. He was Snorky.
I think we need to bring that back into rotation, Johanna.
Yeah.
You're looking mighty snorky tonight. Is that only for men? Or could a woman also be described as looking quite
I think
snorky?
Nowadays, everything is kind of fluid.
That's true. All right. I'm bringing snorky back. All right. So now that you have... This is fascinating to me. I can't get over the snorkiness of it all. Okay. Now you have some background. And as Johanna said, some of this comes back into play in the next few episodes. So let's talk about the family that this week's episode is all about, and that's the DeFeo family. Louise Marie Brigante was born on November 3rd, 1931, as the oldest child and only daughter to Michael and Angelina Brigante. Michael Brigante was the owner of a Buick dealership in Brooklyn, and it was successful and the family was pretty well off. Louise grew up to be a beautiful and smart woman. I read in one of the sources that she was thinking of going into modeling. She had, her bone structure is stunning. She has really, and actually, I think her son, Ron Jr., looks just like her, more like her than his dad. Sometime in 1950, she meets Ronald Joseph DeFeo, who was born on November 16th, 1930, to Rocco and Antoinette DeFeo. I believe he was their only child. And when Ronnie met Louise, he was handsome and charming, and Louise fell for him really quickly. Louise's parents were not happy about this. They didn't approve of the relationship. I guess they wanted her to marry into a more affluent family. But Louise didn't care if her parents approved or not. She married Ronnie in 1951. So this to me was impressive. Louise's parents were apparently so upset that she decided to marry him that they didn't talk to her for a while. They just sort of gave her the silent treatment. until the birth of their first grandchild, Ronald DeFeo Jr. He was also called Butch by most of his friends. So now there's a grandchild, and now her parents are like, well, now we're stuck. Now that there's a kid involved, we're stuck, right? So now that they have a grandchild, Michael caves, and he offers the son-in-law he can't stand a well-paying job at the Buick dealership. In total, the couple would go on to have 5 children. After Ronnie Jr., his sister Dawn Teresa was born on July 29th, 1956. On August 16th, 1961, Allison Louise was born. They welcomed Mark Gregory on September 4th, 1962, and their youngest was John Matthew, born on October 24th, 1965. The marriage of Louise and Ronnie Sr. was not great. I think that's probably an understatement. He was apparently physically abusive to Louise and the children. He was short-tempered and moody. And sometime in the early 1960s, Louise took the children and left Ronnie for a while.
Annie, I have no idea if that was already known to you, but it's something I just read the other day and I couldn't believe it, and I checked it and verified it. So Ronnie Sr. apparently was so upset by his wife leaving that he wrote a love song to her, or rather co-wrote a love song. The song was titled The Real Thing. And now everyone can scribble some lyrics on a piece of paper or a napkin, right? Trying to impress his partner with it. But this song was actually recorded by the jazz singer Joe Williams in 1963, and you can find it on the album One is a Lonesome Number. And here's some of the lyrics, quote, "If you are going with her and you can't win, if you're constantly in a spin, if the winter time feels like spring, it's not puppy love, it's the real thing. So when you fall in love, go all the way and thank your lucky stars for the day. When you can be sure it's not a fling, then your heart will know it's the real thing." Joe Williams, by the way, won a Grammy Award. Not for this song, but...
Clearly.
And he was also added to the Grammy Hall of Fame. And if you don't know his music, I'm sure all our 80s and 90s kids out there, you might know him from his role as Cliff Huxtable's father-in-law on The Cosby Show.
Yes, definitely. I actually did find that out. I heard the song. Yeah.
Isn't it crazy that when you see the lyrics and you're like, written by Ronnie DeFeo Sr., and they're like, what? Wait, what?
Yeah. And I really do wonder if her parents could sense that he was bad for her, I think her parents must have seen something that she just couldn't see, because it just reminded me, I was in a very emotionally abusive relationship in college that at the time I had no idea was, you're in it, you don't see it sometimes.
Yeah.
And when my parents came to visit, I'm not even joking, my dad didn't speak a word and pretended he didn't exist for an entire weekend.
And your dad is the nicest guy.
The nicest guy. He hated this guy so fucking much. He literally would be like, "So, Mr. Jackson, blah, blah," and my dad would just look in a different direction. He just pretended he wasn't there. That really reminded me of her parents' reaction to him, and then I think once they had a kid, they realized, all right, this is it, this is what it is, and they gave up. But I think her parents knew that he was bad news, and I don't think it had anything to do with his financial standing. You know what I mean?
Possible, yeah.
I mean, I'm sure they would have preferred that, don't get me wrong, but I think if she had married a poor guy who was also just a really good guy who loved his wife and kids and never hit them and worked for I think it all would have been, well, anyway.
Yeah, especially as they really seem to love Louise. Like, they did everything for her.
Everything. Yeah. They really tried so hard to make their daughter's family life as good as it could be. But she did eventually return to her husband, and as we said, in 1965, their youngest child, John, was born, and the place where they were living in Brooklyn had started to be too small for this family of 7. So they started to look for something that would be more accommodating for them, and they found it in Amityville, in the suburban residential neighborhood on Ocean Avenue. The house was built in the 1920s in the Dutch colonial style, and it sits on a property of about 1/4 of an acre.
That's so interesting to me. That's the size of our property, almost exactly. It's smallish for the US, but actually considered decent sized here. So that's around 1,100 square meters. I always thought the property was bigger. I don't know, maybe because of the boat and the, I don't know how it's laid out.
Their house is, well, based on photos, I would have thought yours was twice that size.
Really?
Yeah, that's the size of my last house yard. And I think that's actually the perfect size. I think, is Austria the same where in most of other places I've been, like in the UK and Europe, your homes are better soundproofed than ours and they're closer to the street? Is that true? Would you say there too?
True.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You really do maximize that space you have, whereas here you're usually set further back from the street, so you've got some front yard.
Yeah, we don't have that.
Yeah.
Very rare that you see. That's just like really estate style houses.
Exactly.
Bigger houses that have like this driveway up. It's very, very rare.
Yeah. And in this case, their house, it sits sideways on the lot, and their lot, so imagine that their lot is long and thin. It's a long, thin rectangle, still a quarter acre, but it's not a square. It's a rectangle. And if you're standing, it sits sideways on the lot. So from the street, when you're looking at the house, you're staring at the right-hand side of the house. The left side of the house faces the water and the dock and all of that, and the front door is on the right-hand side. And then there's like a boathouse and a dock and a pool, and it's all right there on the waterfront. I think it's Amityville Creek, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so, yeah.
The pool is gone now, but at the time, they did have a pool. The house itself is about 5,000 square feet. I've heard different accounts. I've heard 4,000 and I've heard 5,000. Either way, it's a huge house, about 460 square meters on 3 stories. I think the most iconic thing about the house is the gambrel roof and the now famous 3rd floor attic windows, right? They were those quarter circle windows, and I would argue one of the best architectural elements of the home.
I agree.
It is the best part, though. And listeners who don't know what a gambrel roof is, it's a really typical roof shape for Dutch colonial houses. Imagine the roof of a barn, from homeedit.com, quote, "These roofs have 2 slopes on each side, maximizing the area underneath. Gambrel roofs are simple to build, shorten an otherwise tall roof, and have graced myriad American properties since the late 1600s, end quote.
I think it's very pretty. I like the house a lot. Mm-hmm. And I know we will get more into all of it next week, but I just like to say that the reason why now we see photos of the house and think it looks sinister, and the quarter circle attic windows are like eyes and they're staring at you and it's so bad. I think it's because now we know what happened there and we remember the movies and the posters. I mean, okay, having the exterior in this very dark color really didn't make it look too friendly. It's very unusual for my eye, for example. I can never tell from pictures, Annie. Do you think it was black or just a very, very, very dark red? I read somewhere that it was black, but I'm not so sure.
So that's an interesting question, actually. I never really thought about it because I always assumed one common color here on older antique homes. You'll often see a very dark brown stain on a cedar shingle. Mm-hmm. So that's what I thought it was. You'll see it sometimes in Salem. It's more of a New England color. So New York is close enough. I always assumed it was like that dark brown stain, but it is dark with that white trim.
That makes sense because it was wooden shingles on the side.
I think it's maybe just like stained a dark, dark brown with like the white trim. Oh, I love that house.
All right. If I remember correctly, then the house was sold to the DeFeos for $64,000 in the late 60s. That would be $600,000 today. So that was quite some money even back in the day.
Yeah, at least. Yeah, that's a lot.
And of course, the question is, how did Ronnie Sr. afford the purchase of the house? His job paid him well, don't get me wrong, but nowhere near enough to have that kind of money on the side while also supporting a whole family, right? Mm-hmm. The answer is Louise's father, Michael Briganti, supported them. I'm not sure if he just paid for the house or just helped with the down payment, but he did help them. As we said, he just really loved his daughter and he wanted to support her any way he could and make her happy. So the family moved in and they named the house High Hopes. I think that was Ronnie Sr.'s idea. He probably had the hope that living in this affluent neighborhood would heighten his own social standing. And he had a wooden sign with the house's name made and he hung it out there on the lawn. They also had a shrine put in on the front lawn. It was the statue of St. Joseph. Mm-hmm. So the DeFeos, they were Italian. had Italian heritage, and they were Catholics like me. And Saint Joseph is the patron saint of not only the Universal Church, but also the patron saint of families, fathers, interestingly enough, house owners and house buyers, and expecting mothers, also the patron saint of immigrants. So everything to do with family, you got it pretty much covered with Saint Joseph. And Saint Joseph was also the patron saint of the DeFeo family. I'm not sure if that was something Ronnie Sr. decided, or if Saint Joseph had been the patron saint for the family for many generations already. Whatever it was, Ronnie had this shrine put in, and he and his family would pray there often. They would also visit the Saint Joseph's Oratory Shrine in Montreal.
Yeah, my aunts used to visit there pretty regularly.
They would even take friends of the family with them, and they would also have friends come over and pray rosaries with them. So they were practicing Catholics, and their faith played a big part in their lives.
Oh, yeah.
Talking about friends, the kids made friends quickly. They were really nice, sweet kids. Dawn would become best friends with a girl her age who lived close by. Mark was an athlete. I think he played football, and he made lots of friends that way. John, the youngest one, eventually joined the Boy Scouts. So they lived this, from a European perspective, it's what I would like to call the all-American upper middle class dream life.
Yes.
That's so unattainable for so many people. You know, living with their beautiful kids and their dog, and he was a sheepdog named Shaggy, and it's a great dog, and they have this beautiful home in this beautiful neighborhood. Everything looks so perfect, right? But something was looming below this picture-perfect surface, and some people who knew the family best could feel it. Dawn's friend was later quoted in a newspaper, quote, "The one thing that kept them together was their faith. You could feel it in their house," end quote. And I know some will take it as you could feel how big their faith was, how important it was, but I take it as something more like you could feel there was something going on, right?
Yes. I take that as their faith was the thing that kept them from separating.
Yeah. So Ronnie Sr. hadn't really changed after Louise had left him. I think there was still a lot of anger issues, rage, and physical and emotional violence going on in this house. The fact that Ronnie Sr. was employed by his father-in-law and needed his father-in-law to financially support the family probably didn't help with certain self-esteem issues.
Yeah.
And he was also very demanding when it came to his kids, especially when it came to Ronnie Jr. As the firstborn son, there was a lot of pressure and high expectations on him. And Ronnie Jr. didn't handle these expectations too well. Also, he didn't have the easiest time. I think he was bullied at school, at least for a while, because of his weight.
Mm-hmm.
And he began acting out and turned into kind of a troublemaker. He got expelled from at least 3 schools. He got caught stealing an outboard motor, and he got probation for that. Ronnie Sr. and Louise did take him to see a psychiatrist at least once. I don't think too much came of it.
No.
He then started to work for his father in the service department of the family car dealership. And I assume Ronnie Sr. did this for 2 reasons. First of all, to help Ronnie Jr. to get his life on track. And second, to have him under his supervision or his control. I think Ronnie Sr. did like to have control over his whole family.
Yeah.
But of course that didn't work. We can all imagine how much working together with someone of your family, if you're already having a really hard time dealing with them the rest of the day, well, that must have complicated the relationship even more. Because now all of a sudden your dad, who puts you under a lot of pressure and doesn't allow any backtalk, is your boss at work as well.
Yeah.
And Ronnie Jr. became more and more short-tempered. He was known to get into fights, and he had clearly some anger issues. I want to make one thing absolutely clear. I'm in no way saying that what was about to happen is to blame on one of the victims, but we still need to discuss the things that probably had a play in all of this. I know people then always come at me and say, "Oh, you're always excusing this kind of behavior." No, I'm trying to explain it. I'm not excusing it.
No.
That's the difference.
Well, there's a huge difference. I don't think, one thing that just occurred to me, I think Ronnie Jr., I don't think he actually went to work very often. I think that was a pretty rare occurrence. And he just got paid. And I think it is universally accepted, right, that Ronnie Sr. was a very abusive, mentally and physically abusive parent. And I think that pattern of abusing a family member and then giving them cash gifts or, I don't know, writing a song.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
was pretty much the toxic normality in this family. You know what I mean? It's that, it almost feels like a cliche to say like, oh, well, he was, beating up regularly members of the family and then sort of feeling guilty about it and giving them cash and gifts and guns and whatever they wanted, take it, whatever you wanted.
Yeah. I think he even got a boat.
Yeah.
Things like this. Yeah.
It's wild. And that there's no way that we can talk about this case and not talk about that because it's so part of just everything.
So Ronnie Jr. started taking drugs. According to his friends, it was mostly heroin, LSD, and I think speed, which is not a good combination.
Oof.
And as Annie said, I think his father was overall rather generous with money. I don't think he was a frugal person, especially when it came to his family. So Ronnie Jr. apparently did have enough spending money to go partying with his friends. And as Annie said, he even got paid weekly apart from his job. I think he got like $500 every week, which again is a lot of money back then. So yeah, there were days where he just didn't show up for work at all. It didn't matter.
No.
On 1st of November 1974, Ronnie Jr. was handed $18,000. Some sources say $19,000, but in that ballpark, at work, and he was told to take it to the bank and deposit it. But wouldn't you know it, on his way to the bank, he got robbed, and the money was gone. And of course, almost everybody was thinking what you might be thinking right now. There was no robbery, and Ronnie Jr. just took the money. I don't know what he needed the money for, maybe for drugs, or maybe he had debts because of his drug habit, or maybe it was just a way to fuck with his dad, or maybe he wanted to use the money to get away from his home. He was questioned not only by the police, but more so by his father, and I'm sure Ronnie Sr. had a pretty good idea of what had happened to that money. So the tension between father and son grew even more. And there is this one story that one time they got in a very bad argument and it got so out of hand that Ronnie Jr. got his rifle and held it to his dad's head and actually pulled the trigger, but either it wasn't loaded or it jammed. So yeah, nothing happened, but I don't know. I'm still not sure what to think about this story because I don't see Ronnie Sr. as the kind of person who just, lets it slide, who just gets over the fact that his oldest son just pulled the trigger on him. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it did happen. I heard that he did, well, what I've read is that he pulled the trigger. I don't think he necessarily held the gun to his dad's head or anything, but he pointed the gun at his dad and pulled the trigger and it misfired. It could be a story because with this case, it's not super easy to tell. But I could also see that happening, and I could see Senior just being like, oh shit, and kind of not doing anything immediately because everything kind of ramps up kind of quickly from this point.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't surprise me if he just said, oh, it was, he was on drugs or oh, it was whatever. I don't think people who are controlling abusers expect that the tables will be flipped on them.
Now we will get into what happened in the early hours of Wednesday, 13th of November 1974. And I want to say that even though this is a solved case with a convicted murderer, there are a lot of rumors and theories surrounding this case. We might mention a couple of them today. But in general, we will stick with what was reported back in the day and the things that were presented as facts in court in this episode. We will, however, talk a bit more about the theories and rumors in episode 3. So if you listen to this episode and think, I can't believe they didn't mention this or that, or they left out this story, be patient. We will get to most of it eventually.
Yeah, today we're just trying to stick to the facts, the actual 100% facts. So here we go. It's the afternoon of November 13th, and Ronnie DeFeo Jr. is sitting in a bar about a half a mile from his home. It's just a few blocks away. It's called Henry's Bar and Grill, and he's sitting there drinking and chatting away with the other patrons. Every so often, he'd get up and go to the payphone and try to call his house, but nobody would answer. He then left to go home, but he returned a short while later, around 6:30 p.m., and he is clearly very distraught. He runs into the bar and he says something like, "You need to help me. I think my family's been shot." So, of course, everyone at first is like, what the fuck? What? Like, what? Who, shot? What? But Ronnie Jr.'s like, something's really wrong at home. I need help. Like, please, somebody come help me. So everyone's like, all right. So 5 people, including the owner of Henry's, they jump into the car and they drive a couple blocks back to the DeFeo house. And some people are like, why did they drive? It's like, well, it was freezing and they're on the ocean and it's, it's fine. They get out of the car and Ronnie, he's not going to go inside. He wants no part of it. He's distraught. He can't go in. So he stays outside and his friends enter the home. The only thing that you could hear was Shaggy barking frantically. So don't worry, Shaggy's okay. Physically. No dogs are harmed. First, they go into the master bedroom, and that's where they find Ronnie Sr. and Louise. Louise's body was covered with a blanket, but Ronnie Sr. is lying on the bed on his stomach, and there's a visible shotgun wound in his back. Then they went into the boys' room. Mark and John shared a room across the hall from the master bedroom. And that's where they found both John and Mark, both in their beds, both laying on their stomachs with shotgun wounds in their backs. Next to Mark's bed was a gray wheelchair and some crutches because he had injured himself while playing football, and he was still recovering from that and needed those to get around. So the men see these obviously dead parents and the two boys, and they go back downstairs and they call 911. We have a transcript from the 911 call, and we're not going to read it to you, but we'll post a link in case you'd like to read the whole thing. It's a lot of the guy who called explaining how to spell his name. His name was Yeswit. The man who calls tells them that police need to come, that everyone in the house is dead. He said that there are 4 bodies, obviously because they hadn't found Allison and Dawn yet. Then he had to run outside to try to find the house number because he didn't know it. So the police arrive, and it doesn't take long to discover there were actually 6 bodies. They found Allison in her bed covered with a pink blanket. She was also lying on her stomach and had been shot in the head. Dawn was found in her bed, just like Allison, also covered with her blanket on her stomach and shot in the head. So the victims and their ages were Ronnie DeFeo Sr., 43, Louise, 42, Dawn, 18, Allison, 13, Mark, 12, John, 9. That's awful. 6 people. So the police questioned Ronnie, and he's, of course, the sole survivor, and they had no idea yet what had happened, and so they took him into protective custody. Because for a short time in the beginning, the police thought it was possibly a mafia-related murder, because Ronnie Jr. told police all about his great-uncle, and he worried that this could have been a hit to send a message. When he's talking about his great-uncle, he's talking about Ronnie Sr.'s uncle, Peter DeFeo. This is from Newsday, Nassau edition, 15 November 1974. Quote, "When 6 members of the Ronald J. DeFeo Sr. family were reported murdered, one police unit called in was the Suffolk County Organized Crime Control Bureau. There was an outside chance that the killings were somehow mob-connected. There were none of the traditional earmarks of underworld killings, but DeFeo was the nephew of Peter DeFeo, a 72-year-old captain in the Vito Genovese crime family. Peter DeFeo has never been convicted but has been arrested on murder charges and was charged in 1968 with attempting to obtain kickbacks from the Teamsters Union Central State Prison Fund. There was only the slightest suspicion that the deaths of DeFeo, his wife, 2 sons, and 2 daughters were the work of mob figures. Children and wives are not marked for death in underworld contracts, and the victim of an underworld killing is not slain in his home. He is killed away from his home, told that he is to be killed, and why. Nevertheless, the police felt they had to check on the possibility of a gang setup." End quote. I love that. I like how they're like, listen, this isn't the mob. The mob takes you out of the house, they tell you why they're killing you, and then they kill you. Okay. Thing is, once the police searched the crime scene, it became more and more clear that the surviving son, Ronnie DeFeo Jr., was the culprit, and they charged him the very next day on the 14th of November. As a motive, they found that the parents had a life insurance policy of over $200,000, which would be around $1.2 million today. Old-timey money is always weird to me. Do you know what I mean? Because, like, I think the house is worth $1 million today. But back then it was $60,000. So it's like, it never seems... It's a lot of money.
I mean, the house increased in value without the inflation.
Right. It was a lot of
Things
money.
get
It was
more
horse
value.
money.
Yeah.
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 It wasn't just carpet money.
They found rifles and ammunition in Ronnie's room, which was... His room was actually the one with the cool windows.
Yep.
They also found like a holster for a handheld gun, but again, that's episode 3. At first, they thought that Ronnie had drugged the whole family the night before during dinner to make sure that they wouldn't wake up, because actually he told the investigators that he had done that when he was confessing, but during the autopsy, they couldn't find any proof of any of that. There was nothing in the blood. And we will talk more about that again in episode 3. Please don't get frustrated now. But keep in mind, the big question is for that episode. How did he manage to murder 6 people? Why did they keep all on their stomach, lying down on their stomach, and nobody tried to flee or fight back? Right?
Lots to discuss.
Yeah. So, how the investigators reconstructed the events of the night and early morning. The family had gone to bed, and Ronnie Jr. was downstairs in the basement where there was a TV room that the kids like to use.
Yeah, it was a sweet finished basement.
Yeah. And he was watching the 1969 film Castle Keep, and it's with Burt Lancaster and Bruce Dern, and it's a World War II movie. So around 3 a.m. he grabbed his .35 caliber lever-action rifle, and he went upstairs. First, he shot his parents, and then he made his way through his siblings' bedrooms. And after everyone was dead, he took off his bloody clothes and he placed everything in a pillowcase. He then showered and shaved and got dressed. He took the rifle and pillowcase and drove to work, early for once. That should have been suspicious already.
Right.
On his way, he dumped the things, I think the pillowcase in a storm drain and in a trash can. And I think the rifle was found in the creek behind the house, actually. So the police found all of this stuff. And so Ronnie went to work, and after work he went to his girlfriend. I don't think her name is really important here. While he was at her house, he tried to call his family several times, but obviously nobody answered. He then took his girlfriend shopping, and after spending time with her, he took her back home and he met with his friends, and they partied and they took heroin, and somehow they ended up at Henry's, and you know the rest of the story already. He was charged with 6 counts of second-degree murder, and I was like, wait a minute, second-degree murder? How? And I found the answer in a newspaper article covering the murders, and this is from Newsday, the Nassau edition, 15th of November 1974, page 3, quote, "Under New York state laws, only persons accused of killing peace officers, so that's policemen or prison guards, can be charged with first-degree murder. In other homicides, the most serious charge is second-degree murder, which carries a penalty of from 25 years to life in prison." End quote. So that was interesting to me that it was like that back in the day.
It is interesting. I'm not sure I would say it was like that back in the day, though. I think that's still not necessarily the first, second-degree thing, but there's always a more serious punishment for killing a police officer. So,
I mean, yeah, that's the same here, but that you can only be charged for first-degree murder if it's a police officer or prison guard. I think they don't have that anymore.
Not anymore. No.
So Ronnie DeFeo Jr. did change his story so many times, and he would continue to change it even after the trial. But let's talk about what he claimed during the trial. That started on 14th of October 1975. His lawyer went for not guilty on reason of insanity. And at first his grandfather Michael Brigante had paid for Ronnie Jr.'s defense lawyer, but I think Ronnie caused a lot of issues with the lawyer, especially when the lawyer suggested that they should go for the insanity defense. And so Michael was like, listen, I'm done paying for this. I think he had paid like $40,000. I'm not sure if that's true because that sounds like a lot of money. But basically it was like, you're on your own now.
Yeah.
However, Michael Brigante did appear in court as a defense witness, and I found this little excerpt from the Newsday Nassau edition, 29th of October 1975 on page 6, very interesting. Quote, "Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s grandfather, tears in his eyes, walked over to his grandson in court yesterday, put both arms around him, kissed him on both cheeks, said something undiscernible in Italian, then told him, "Here's a kiss from Grandma," slapped him on the back, and started to walk out of the courtroom. But as Michael Brigante Sr. was leaving, he looked back at DeFeo and said, Cooperate with the law enforcement. Tell them the truth shall make you free." End quote. I think it shows exactly how hard this is for families. So you have your grandson who you love, but he murdered all of the other people you love as well. And how do you ever deal with that?
Yeah, this little snippet right here about Michael Brigante just makes me want to cry. What they went through really is everybody's absolute worst nightmare. Can you imagine losing your whole, there's nothing more horrific than that, to lose your daughter and all of your grandchildren. They may have had other grandchildren, but you know what I mean. Nothing that had or would ever happen in that house, ever, would ever be as bad as what the Brigantes went through, losing their whole family. That is the true Amityville horror right there.
That's so true.
Yeah.
That's really, I can absolutely agree with that.
Yeah.
So Ronnie had the defense attorney assigned to him by the court, and the new defense attorney convinced Ronnie that the best strategy would be the insanity thing. The defense had him checked out by a psychiatrist, and he diagnosed an antisocial personality disorder, and together with the heavy drug use, mostly heroin, LSD, speed, that he was self-medicating with, this led probably to hallucinations. Ronnie said that he had heard voices telling him that his family was plotting against him, that they were planning to kill him, and that he therefore thought he was acting in self-defense. Of course, the prosecution had their own psychiatrist, and that one said that yes, Ronnie Jr. was a drug user, and yes, he had an antisocial personality disorder, but he still knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about this more later, but no matter how mentally ill he was, and I think he was actually more mentally ill than just antisocial personality disorder, he really went to some lengths to try and hide what he had done. He hid his evidence. He made fake phone calls. He called his house knowing everybody was dead. He pretended like it was a normal day going to work, which isn't even something he normally does. Clearly, he was trying to hide what had happened, and none of these acts imply insanity as defined by the courts.
I think he was diagnosed later on when he was already in prison with more issues.
Yeah, I'm sure.
As far as I remember.
Yeah.
So on 21st of November 1975, he was found guilty and sentenced to 6 consecutive terms of 25 years each. The judge called the murders of the DeFeo family, quote, "the most heinous murders committed in Suffolk County since its founding," end quote. And Ronnie DeFeo Jr. spent the rest of his life at the Sullivan Correctional Facility. He married 3 times while he was there. He had his parole denied 8 times, and he died there on 12th of March 2021 at the age of 69. And it's such a sad case, and I know because of the subsequent haunting and the book and the movies, this murder became this huge, scary thing. And I remember back in the day having the impression, oh wow, out of the blue this young man just, took a rifle, shot his whole family because he heard demonic voices.
Yes.
Which is just a teeny tiny part of this story, and there's so much more to it, and a lot has to do with untreated mental health issues at a time where there was so much stigma around all of it, plus the abuse and the overall toxic family situation. It's sad overall.
It's
really
incredibly sad. It's incredibly sad. And just, I don't know. We'll talk more about how frustrating aspects of this are later. By the way, the DeFeo family was laid to rest in a family grave together with Ronnie Sr.'s parents, Rocco and Antoinette. They both died in the 80s, so after the murders. The headstone shows the figure of St. Joseph holding baby Jesus, and it reads, "St. Joseph, pray for us." Now, as we said, there are some controversies, theories, rumors. So many rumors and theories. And we're going to get into all of that in episode 3. But right now, we're going to end this episode with a fantastic interview Johanna had with one of our listeners and a friend of the show, Laura, who actually talked to Ronnie DeFeo. She was in a program similar to the one I did and was able to meet Ronnie and talk to him. So just these are obviously her experiences and thoughts on the case, but we thought it was too interesting not to share.
Yeah.
So we're going to share with you this wonderful chat that Laura and Johanna had. Please don't forget to vote for us in the People's Choice Podcast Awards. Thank you for sticking with us for 200 episodes.
Thank you.
Can't wait. Get back here next week and the week after to keep talking about this fascinating story. And don't forget, if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.
All right, so I think we start with you introducing yourself.
Okay, well, hi, I am Laura Sedekis. I am a longtime listener of Fresh Hell. I love the podcast so much. I went to school in college for forensic psychology, which is essentially criminal profiling with a specialty in interrogations. St. John's University, my dean at the time was kind of a big deal in the prison system's psychiatric programs. So he was able to get me into a number of interviews with some really interesting people. And that's how I came to have spoken to Ronald DeFeo Jr.
So you spoke to him like face to face or via phone?
I went to visit him.
That's so interesting because I watched an interview just before we started to just get a feel for how he was, how he talked.
Mm-hmm.
And what they said is that he's dead now. He died in 2021, I think.
Correct,
but he always had a lot of people requesting interviews with him, and he didn't meet with a lot of people. So it was very rare that he agreed to give an interview or to have visitors at all.
So that was true, except around the time, from what my experience was around that time. It was like the year 2000-ish, the aughts there. He was giving more interviews than normal for like a certain span of time. He was interviewed for Rick Osuna's book. He was interviewed for a television documentary. I think it was on CBS. I don't remember which one exactly. But it was like a flurry of time, and I was really lucky to just get jumped right in there.
Do you have any idea why he gave more interviews at that time?
So at that time he had filed a motion to vacate his conviction based on a new theory of the crime.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at that time he was trying to get, I'm so sorry, there's an ambulance going by right now. We'll just give it a second to, all right. Nothing happens in this town except for right now. Okay, and he's gone. So at that time he was trying to get his conviction vacated.
Mm-hmm.
He had put forth another theory of the crime that the court was willing to hear. It was ultimately denied, so he stayed in, but I think that's why at that time he was giving more interviews. I think he thought that I was like in conjunction with writing a book, or maybe it was a favor with my professor, my dean, but I'm not really sure. Not to be conceited, I was fairly pretty young girl. I think that had a little bit to do with it.
So you have this appointment with him, and you go through all these checks, and you get into the visitation room, I guess, or were you separated? How was that?
We were separated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were separated. So I spoke to him. We weren't even in the same room. It was via a video feed.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
So, we weren't like face to face like that, but we were in the same place because at that time, his mannerisms I found very interesting. So what I was there for primarily was the forensic psychology side of it.
Mm-hmm.
Looking to see, what somebody with his diagnoses would have, like how they would act, right? He was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, I'm looking here in my notes. He was also a frequent heroin and LSD user.
Mm-hmm.
When I met with him in prison, my honest gut thought was that he was on something then.
Okay.
Well, you know, there were multiple theories to this crime, and he put, you know, forth so many that at that point everything was sort of getting jumbled up.
Yeah.
So
about his mannerism. So I read that the prison guards always say that he was like this model inmate, and he was very soft-spoken, never made a lot of trouble. He was like in this prison honor block where he had some special privileges, right?
So that was late. That was a little bit later on.
After you met him.
Yeah, that would have been after I met him. He was, you know, he was already like aging when I met him. He was like kind of a small dude, you know. He was more slight than I would have expected him to be.
Okay.
I guess if I had to describe his mannerisms, it would have been Brooklyn Hustler.
Okay.
It reminded me of so many of my friends from kind of the neighborhood in the way of low-key trying to get over.
You have to explain it to me as a European.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the words to put that as a European. Kind of like you're expecting someone to be running a con on you. Even if it's a small con.
Okay.
But it's always a con, right? Like there's always you have to read between the lines to get to the truth of what this person is saying. Ultimately, very much a survivor type mentality.
Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting when he spoke about the crimes that he did not have very much of an emotional reaction to it. Now, this is, you know, 30 years later, right? He's told this story a billion times. He may not really be very emotionally attached to it any longer. The version that he told me was a little bit different. What he told me was that Dawn had this boyfriend in Florida. She wanted to go down to Florida to live with him. She was like 17, 18 at the time, like of age to go do that, but just, you know, culturally where she was in her life at the time, she really did. She wanted her parents' approval for this sort of thing. When he described his father, it was like the most emotion he showed, and that would have been extreme contempt. The relationship was pretty volatile. That night, they had an argument. He had told me that he wasn't there. He was in New Jersey at the time. And there was a big argument in the house. Somebody called him and summoned him to the house. Got there, kind of, you know, diffused the situation a little bit. And then in talking to Dawn was like convincing him that this cannot keep going with their parents the way they are. You know, the dad's super abusive. Mom lets it happen. Sick of this bullshit. And they make a plan. The plan is to come back in the middle of the night and get the kids out. Take them to a relative's house. Dawn was supposed to be doing that while Ronnie made some preparations. It was pretty vague on what he was doing at the time, but he had left the house. When he came back to the house, everybody was dead except for Dawn, and including the children. And he was like, well, why didn't you take them where they were supposed to be? And she was like, well, you know, how could they live without parents? And they're going to be a big draw on us. Like, you know, we have to take care of them. They're younger. And he was quite upset about that. That led to the argument with him shooting Dawn. He claimed to me that she was the only person that he shot.
Yeah,
I personally don't believe that.
He implied that Dawn murdered everybody else while he was out of the house. And
correct.
Then they had a fight coming back.
Yes, they had a fight coming back when he came back and noticed that the kids are all there and dead.
Yeah.
Was like, this was not the plan. And then he got into the scuffle with Dawn and shot her. The forensic, like, to be quite clear, the forensic evidence does not support that at all. You know, I think ultimately he was a bit of an opportunist. I remember while I was visiting him, he had made some comment about how I should like save my ID. And it turned out when you had to go visit someone in there, you like as an inmate, you have your inmate ID. You turn it in before you come out to the visiting area where your like bank is for your video call or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The COs were just like pocketing his IDs and selling them on eBay, and would just print him another one and give him. He was implying that they gave him a cut of that sort of thing. I did find his IDs on eBay later.
I mean, he was probably the most the highest profile inmate at the time there, I'd say.
Yeah, probably at that time. I think David Berkowitz got transferred out by the time he was there.
Yeah,
but he was there for a while too. Yeah, I don't know. He struck me as like the ultimate opportunist.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty easy to blame the majority of the murders on a dead person. Because,
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Was that the theory that he wanted to bring forward as new theory in the case?
That was exactly the theory that he was bringing forward in the case. Yeah. He said it with some conviction, but I don't think he believed it.
Yeah.
Either. Not really.
It's more like, well, let's try this. I mean, he had a lot of time thinking about things, how he could, phrase it or present it to make a new case for himself. Yeah.
I mean, you figure his initial theory of the crime when he was the only surviving member of this family was that the mob did it.
Yeah.
And, the cops went off of that for a good few days before beating him up in Suffolk County. So Suffolk County, Long Island had a bit of a problem in that era of like, police brutality and coerced confessions.
Confession, yeah.
Coerced confessions. So his case did have some wiggle room.
So that's a thing that could have totally been possible at the time, that the police...
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't remember if it was his mugshot or his first appearance in court. If you look at the pictures, you'll notice like he looks like he's got some black eyes going on, like he's pretty messed up. And he had claimed that happened when he was being interrogated, and that he told me that as well, and I absolutely believe that part, 100%.
I mean, that happens all the time, everywhere around the world.
Everywhere.
Yeah. You can't say that never happened. True.
Yeah.
So Annie and I were talking about some of the theories, and the thing that we keep circling back to is there were a lot of shots fired that night. Why did nobody hear it? And I think you have a theory about that.
I do have a theory about that. So, like I said earlier, his family life was really volatile. The dad was fairly abusive. That was really well known in the neighborhood. There were like family friends who went on vacation with them who would attest to this. There were friends of the children who would attest to that. And Ron DeFeo Sr. seemed like he had some mental illness going on as well. He would do things like go out into the street and like pray at the shrine that he had set up in front of his house really loudly, very loud arguments, up to and including gunshots that, just firing guns or whatever. I think what ended up happening is that people did hear those shots, but because this was the house that there was just so much going on, they tuned it out. It's really easy to do as a city dweller.
Basically that there was so much noise at all hours of the day and people were fed up with it. But what can you do, right? If it's a rather hostile or aggressive person living there, mostly you don't want to confront them about that. So you just try to ignore it as best as you can.
Yeah. I mean, Ronald DeFeo Sr. did have some mob ties, Italian mafia ties. He would have been the type of person that people would be a little bit afraid of.
Yeah.
So you don't necessarily want to bring trouble to that guy's house.
Yeah.
So you just look the other way.
Yeah.
And also, like, if this is a house where you're constantly hearing people firing guns just, for target practice, like shooting at cans or, there was a little bit of land there. You're constantly hearing arguments. You're constantly hearing all this crazy stuff. But nothing major, nothing serious has ever happened. When you wake up in the night hearing that stuff, you're just going to be like, oh, well,
it's just
like the crazy house again.
Yeah.
We're going to, nothing serious is happening. Like you would never expect. It's like that neighborhood was really like, your typical American dream community at that time of, happy people with their little lives and there was a bit of an underbelly, and especially Ronnie Jr. was in that underbelly, that like the drug scene and
I sort of watched an interview with him that he gave, I think in 2014, where he kind of implies that the Lutzes, who then later on owned the house, that he knew them because they came for drugs at the time when he was living there. Did you hear something about that?
He did not say that to me, anything about that. So what he said to me about the ghosts was that it was all bullshit.
Yeah.
Those were the words that he used. That was all bullshit. That said, I watched that same interview. It was in some documentary.
Yeah, exactly.
That I found on Discovery. And I mean, I don't know. That's an interesting theory to explore.
So what is your theory? What are your thoughts on what happened that night?
My unpopular opinion was that Dawn was involved somehow. The people outside not hearing anything is one thing. Everybody else in that house not moving is entirely another. I personally think, and there is some forensic evidence to suggest that there would have needed to be a second person committing those crimes. Because it's, you're talking about there were the two parents, then the two boys, and then the other sister, Allison. She was Ronnie's favorite sibling. He told me that personally. I've read that in many other articles and, case studies of this. Now, one of the things that I did find interesting, like, Ronnie had already demonstrated by this point in time that he was capable of lifting a gun, holding it to a family member's head, and pulling the trigger. Because in an earlier argument with his father, he grabbed a rifle, pulled it, and pulled the trigger, but it didn't fire. That's the only reason why his father survived. So, like, there is that. Like, that's a fairly big psychological leap from brandishing a gun to actually
of course it. Yeah,
I do think I think that there maybe if it wasn't Dawn, it was someone else
outside of the family,
one of his friends. There at one point in time, one of the stories that he had said was that the crime was committed with him, Dawn, and two other friends. I don't recall their names off the top of my head, but I do remember reading that one too.
Did you ever drive by the house?
So many times. There were two things that you did in Queens as a teenager on Halloween.
I figured so.
Houdini's grave, or you drove by the Amityville horror house. And when I tell you, these poor people who bought the house did the most to change its appearance.
I know they changed the windows, I think, so it's very different.
They changed the address. That said, so many people were driving past the Amityville horror house on Halloween night every single year that you had cops directing traffic.
Yeah.
If that were me, my friends and I were always like, oh, when we grow up, we should buy this house and open it for tours.
At least for Halloween.
At least for Halloween, like once a year, come on in. $5 a head. Let's go.
When you were driving by, I mean, it's a normal house, right? It doesn't give off like a weird feeling. I think the only weird feeling you get is because you know what happened inside.
Yes. Yeah. I never particularly got a weird feeling from that house. I do get weird feelings from places.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if you guys talked about the whole like Native American burial ground.
That's
theory.
For the next week's episode then.
Yeah. I remember reading the book, and I was young when I first read the Jay Anson book, and I loved it. I still do. And I remember reading like that this portal to hell is in Long Island, in a regular house in Long Island. I'm like, maybe, but I mean, it's got to be somewhere, but I actually don't know.
I talked to Annie about that. She said she was young when she read the book as well, and she was so scared. And now especially now that she's researching for next week's episode about all the haunting stuff that was going on, she said she feels kind of bitter that they scared her so much with that.
I remember reading it, and like there was the Jody the pig, this like pig with glowing red eyes, and I was just like, that's not at all frightening. I would 100% be friends with a demonic pig. Demonic pigs need love too.
You're all very different kind of people, apparently, than the ones who bought the house.
I don't know, the whole like flies congregating in the room thing. Like, no, that would have been it for me. I would have noped the hell out of there as soon as there was fly swarms. Like, no insects. I guess the theme of this whole crime is a whole lot of opportunistic people.
Yeah.
The whole case, whether it's the murders to
the book deal,
you know, the whole haunting deal, and Ed and Lorraine Warren popping up in there. My opinions are just that it was very sad.
It's extremely sad because of
it's extremely
a lot of mental health issues with the abuse in the family. It's a very sad case. Yeah,
generational abuse, and to some extent, that's kind of like the times back then where you didn't acknowledge any of that. You were weak if you acknowledged any sort of mental health, and there wasn't really a whole lot for them to do for you anyway. I mean, Ronald DeFeo Jr. had he been committed for whatever he had going on there, like, an involuntary commitment, he would have ended up in Pilgrim State or Kings Park psychiatric institutions, which were not great places by the 70s. By the 70s, they started out as farms, and they ended as, fairly abusive areas to be.
I don't know. A lot of people always just see the sensationalism behind these cases and the gory details, but I mean, it's real people with a really, really sad life and sad things that happen to them there.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about kids who never had a chance to grow up, who could have done great things, and who could have, had just their own lives, and it was stolen from them for essentially greed. I mean, one thing that I remember asking Ronald DeFeo Jr. was why he did it, why it was done, and that was not something he never directly answered. The most direct answer I got was because Dawn wanted to go live with her boyfriend and my family was abusive. But like, that to me sounded like a bit of a cop-out answer. It was a self-serving answer. It hasn't ever been suggested anywhere that Dawn was anything other than kind of a normal teenage girl.
Yeah.
She never seemed to have exhibited any violence in the past. Ronnie Jr., Ronald DeFeo Jr. absolutely did.
Yeah.
The only reasons I have for thinking that she was involved in the actual murders are those two, like, it's odd that one person could have pulled this off without drugging any members of that family within the house. they pulled all the toxicology reports. Not one of those family members had anything in their system, unless that too is just like, hey, this house has a lot going on. There's a lot of arguments. There's a lot of fighting kind of all the time. Maybe they tuned it out.
Or you tell the kids maybe beforehand. Whatever you hear, stay in your bed. Wait until I come and get you. Yeah.
Lay face down so you don't see anything.
I'm getting goosebumps.
I know. That's the biggest. The face down thing is the one that's bothered me throughout this whole, throughout time of reading this, is that the face down thing was really strange, that they stayed with their faces down.
But maybe also that's what they did when there was an argument in the house, how kids sometimes cover their ears, cover their eyes for these things.
Yeah.
Is there something we missed that you still want to mention?
No. No. I can't think of anything.
Well, then I have to say thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me today.
Of course. Thank you so much. This is kind of a dream come true, not gonna lie. A little bit fun. Hopefully I don't sound like too much of an idiot.
No, it's great. It's going to be great. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.